before the Sanhedrin. It was around 3:30 in the night when the high priest Caiaphas convened the court and had Jesus brought forward for a formal judicial hearing. At 3 previous private sessions, the Sanhedrin had overwhelmingly voted to condemn Jesus to death. They had decided that he was guilty of death based on informal charges of lawbreaking, blasphemy, and disregarding the traditions of their ancestors. This was not a regularly convened meeting of the Sanhedrin, and the session was not held in the usual place. This was a selected group of 30 members of the Sanhedrin gathered in the palace of the high priest. The Apostle John was present throughout this entire so-called trial. How pleased these leaders were that this Jesus was now safely in their hands. He who challenged their authority and dared to cause unrest in their traditional way of life. They were determined that he would never again escape alive from their vengeful grasp. Normally, when the Jews tried someone for a crime, they proceeded with great caution and took all precautions to ensure that the selection of witnesses in the entire process would be fair. But on this occasion, Caiaphas was more a prosecutor than an impartial judge. Jesus appeared before this court in his ordinary clothes, with his hands bound behind his back. The entire assembly was amazed at his majestic appearance and somewhat confused by it. Never before had they seen such a prisoner, nor witnessed such calmness in a man who knew that a death sentence hung over him. Jewish law required that the statements of at least 2 witnesses must agree on any point before it could be charged against the prisoner. Judas could not be used as a witness against Jesus, because Jewish law explicitly forbade the use of a traitor as a witness. More than 20 false witnesses were available, but their statements were so contradictory and so clearly fabricated that even the members of the Sanhedrin were ashamed of their poor acting. Jesus stood there silently and looked at them with mild disdain, and it was precisely this expression that embarrassed the lying witnesses. Throughout the time these false testimonies were given, Jesus spoke not a word. He gave no answer to their many false accusations. The only time the statements of 2 of the many false witnesses even remotely agreed was when 2 men testified that they had recently heard Jesus, during one of his speeches in the temple, say that he would destroy this temple made with hands, and in 3 days build another temple without using his hands. This was not exactly what Jesus had said, aside from the fact that he had pointed to his own body when he made the remark. The high priest Caiaphas lost his patience and shouted at Jesus, "Do you not answer all these charges?" But Jesus did not open his mouth. He stood there silently as all these false witnesses gave their statements. Hatred, fanaticism, and unscrupulous exaggeration characterized the words of these enemies to such an extent that their testimony collapsed under its own weight. The best rebuttal to their false accusations was the calm, majestic silence of the Master. Shortly after the false witnesses began to give their statements, Annas arrived and took his place next to Caiaphas. Annas now stood up and argued that this threat by Jesus to destroy the temple was sufficient grounds to bring 3 charges against him. 1. That he was a dangerous deceiver of the people. That he taught them impossible things, thereby deceiving the people. 2. That he was a ruthless anarchist because he advocated taking violent action against the Holy Temple, for how else could he destroy it? 3. That he was a servant of the devil who taught magic, because he claimed he could build a new temple in a very short time and without hands. The entire Sanhedrin had already agreed that Jesus was guilty of breaking the Jewish laws, for which he deserved the death penalty, but their main concern now was to formulate charges related to his behavior and teachings that could justify Pilate in ratifying the death sentence. They knew they needed the Roman governor's permission before they could legally execute Jesus. Annas intended to follow the strategy of portraying Jesus as a dangerous teacher who could not be allowed to move freely among the people. Caiaphas could no longer bear to see Jesus standing there in perfect calm, without saying a word. He thought he knew at least one way to make the prisoner speak. So he rushed toward Jesus, pointed an accusing finger in his face, and said, "I adjure you by the living God to tell us whether you are the Messiah, the Son of God." Jesus answered Caiaphas, Soon I will go to the Father, and then the Son of Man will be clothed with power, and will reign again over the hosts of heaven." When the high priest heard Jesus utter these words, he became extremely angry, tore his outer garment, and exclaimed, "Why do we need any more witnesses? Behold, you have all now heard the blasphemy of this man. What do you think should be done with this blasphemer?" And they all answered in unison, "He is guilty of death. Let him be crucified." As Jesus stood before the members of the Sanhedrin, he showed no interest in the questions being asked of him, except for the one that related to his mission of self-bestowal. However, when asked if he was the Son of God, he answered immediately and unequivocally in the affirmative. Annas, who inwardly disapproved of his son-in-law's behavior, asked that the trial continue and that specific charges be formulated that would also be punishable under Roman law, so these could then be presented to Pilate. The counselors wanted to finish these matters as quickly as possible, not only because it was the day of preparation for the Passover, during which no heavy work could be done after noon, but also because they were afraid that Pilate might leave on a trip that morning, taking him away from Jerusalem for a few days, which might cause them to lose momentum and force them to wait several days. But Annas failed to keep the council members under control. Caiaphas angrily adjourned this first session, and this high priest stepped forward and struck Jesus hard in the face. Annas looked on disapprovingly but powerlessly as the other members of the court, as they left the room, spat in Jesus' face, and many of them mockingly slapped him with the flat of their hands. Thus ended, in the early Friday morning, around 4:30, this first session in disorder and unprecedented confusion. 30 prejudiced judges, blinded by tradition, along with their false witnesses, presumed to condemn their own righteous creator. These passionate accusers were angered by his silence and the exalted, majestic demeanor of this God-man. His silence is terrible to endure. His words are fearless and defiant. He remained unmoved by their threats and undaunted by their attacks. Humanity conspires against its maker, but even then, he still loves them and would save them if possible.